Hi, welcome back to Cubs and Culture for January 11th, 2018. Okay, moving on to the actual text of Hell or High Water. So, in this section, it will be my first one on the script. So, spoilers. Okay, so Hell or High Water is the story of two brothers, Tanner and Toby, played by Chris Pine and Ben Forrester, who are engaging in a series of bank robberies to get enough money to buy off a lien against their mother's homestead. And then they're being pursued because they're bank robbers again by two Texas Rangers named Marcus and Alberto. Okay, so that's the most basic sort of plot description. It's something like a cat and mouse game between a group of outlaws and sheriffs. Okay, so that's one of the five basic plots. Okay, then of course it also something functions as a homestead story because their mother just died and their family's land is under a lien against a bank. Because she took a reverse mortgage, so they have to get enough money to pay it off. That way, so updated now, right? So with robber baron bank, okay, so it was a function, something that was a homestead story, and then because Toby's main sort of drive or goal in life is to get his kids, because he's been through a messy divorce and he's lived in poverty all his life. He wants his kids to escape poverty. Fortunately, his mother's land is on oil. Okay, and so if he gets the lien off the house, off the homestead, he can then have companies drill it, and he gets like $50,000 a month. So it's his way of going from rags to riches. So it's something functions as a empire story. Okay, then now the other sort of thing is again talking about the most basic reading of the film. Their mother was dying of cancer in the hospital, and the bank sort of screwed them over by barely giving her enough money to survive, to pay her medical bills, and then slapping on a tax amount on it because of wanting them to get the land because of the oil. And the lawyer character they work with, he's also really upset. So the bank they're actually robbing is the same bank they have to pay back. So they're robbing Mid-Texas Bank to pay Mid-Texas Bank. So again, it functions something as a revenge story. So at the most basic level, Hell or High Water can be accurately described as four of the five basic plots of the classical genre, of the classical Western. The only plot it doesn't really contain directly is sort of the Indian cavalry story or the frontier story, but it does get mentioned, and it gets mentioned through a couple of different ways. The first thing is to change the money over into usable, so it's not traceable. They have to go to an Indian casino, so obviously that brings up First People issues. And then one of the Texas Rangers, is actually half Mexican, half First People. His name is Alberto, and he routinely comments and mentions how banks are now replacing white people with like the same way in which white people replace his people. Okay, let me pause for a sec. Okay. So from just the most basic level of the film, you get all five major plots of the genre, and none of this feels artificial. It feels it just feels like the natural progression of the story, and you only realize at the end of it how much of the genre was just included in the basic plot line. Now, it's also the case that the screenplay was clever enough to make sure that pretty much all the major tropes or settings. So, like, this casino functions as a saloon, and so you get some couple gambling scenes. You get a scene with a prostitute or sex worker. which reveals the characters, but the sort of the main sort of way in which sort of the classical genre comes across is Marcus, who's played by Jeff Bridges. He is pretty much, he's well drawn and he's well played, but he's pretty much a sort of a prototypical sheriff in the classical sense. He has locked up, buttoned up masculinity. He's racist. He's constantly ragging on Umberto to be, because he's half Mexican and half First People, etc. And then also sort of the way in which he thinks about how to track down the crime is very traditionalist. They don't use computers, they don't use forensic evidence. It's just through deduction. So he comes across as sort of the embodiment of the classical form. Okay, so from on like its most basic plot level, Hell or High Water gets the classical form. Okay, the other thing it sort of gets in the classical form is it's very peculiarly American, and it's very much centered on the financial crisis of 2009. The movie takes place in 2012 or something, or even today, but it's constantly about, there's a lot of signs of debt. There's references to the Iraq War, etc., etc., etc. So it feels very peculiarly American, and very peculiarly American about this time period, like the Western. So it feels very much like the classical form, that it's a movie trying to deal with what's been happening to the American West actually, and economically and culturally. Okay? Through this sort of, again, virtually every single major plot type of the classical Western is the plot of Hell or High Water. Okay, so that's what it gets from sort of the main chunk of the Western. Now, it gets from the anti-Westerns, or sort of the revisionist Westerns, in that the Ranger character, Marcus, is played by Jeff Bridges. It's a bit like High Noon, where his sort of buttoned up masculinity is a huge problem. His he's racist towards his partner, etc. And so truthfully, the person who stands for law and order kind of represents a shitty order. Likewise, for Toby, who's the hero, or he's the outlaw figure, he's doing a very shitty thing. Because he facilitated his brother Tanner killing several innocent people unintentionally, even though he avoids it. He's involved with that, but he's doing it for a really sort of good reason, in that he wants to help his family escape poverty, etc. So at the end, you end up in a situation where it's Jeff Bridges and Chris Pine, Marcus and Toby, basically setting up a duel in the future, and they both say to each other, I'm going to bring you peace, I'm going to kill you. And the movie gets the ambiguity because it does not take sides. You feel for sort of both of them, because for Jeff Bridges' character, he lost his partner because of the action of the two brothers, and from Tanner's perspective, at this point, Bridges is not Marcus is not a ranger, he's retired, etc. He kind of gets no sympathy, because he's also now acting like a vigilante. Okay, and that's sort of the other thing about Marcus being sort of the embodiment of the classical form, is he's actually retiring, and his job at the end is actually, it's explicit, it's replaced by a woman, right? So the genre is turning over and being replaced. Okay, so that's what it gets from the anti-Western, sort of the moral ambiguity and sort of the way in which the various parts of the Western are reconfigured. Okay, now from the B-Western, is the movie's actually quite funny in places. Tanner, who's played by Ben Forrester, besides being something of a violent person, he's very, he's funny. Marcus, who is Bridges, is also somewhat funny, and then there's a lot of sort of side characters, which I'll talk about next sections, which are also sort of funny. And then the other thing is, at least 3 times in the movie, there's a song either being sung by the characters, that happens only like once, but mostly on the soundtrack, where it functions as like a musical number, where it's actually commenting on what it is. So you kind of get that from the B-Western. You also sort of get that one of the joys of this movie is just seeing how the writer puts the pieces together, how gimmicky it can be. And then directorially, it kind of uses some B-coding, like white and black, white hat, black hat is used a lot for symbolism and playing around with that. Okay, so plot is classical, sort of moral complexity, moral grit is anti, and sort of just as you're watching the film, it's just a great, rockin', entertaining film. So let me pause right there.